before I go too much farther, I want to maybe clarify this series, Revisiting the Mountain. Why would we call it Revisiting the Mountain? Well, it's called the Sermon on the Mount, so you could, take that. It's just obvious, right? It's the Sermon on the Mount, so we're saying a mountain. But, keeping in mind that in this whole case, going back to chapter 5, it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, this is verse 1, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. So this is, again, where it comes from, the Sermon on the Mount. He's on a mountainside. Now, when I was in Israel, I visited the Mount of Beatitudes, which is the place where they believe Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. And it's just an amazing place. You're right at the Sea of Galilee, on the north end of the Sea of Galilee, and this mountain, of course, it looks it's going to look a little different. Lake, water levels are different and stuff. So all that's kind of just beside the point. But just a beautiful place. Thinking of Jesus, just standing there or sitting there, and having these people, these crowds there, sitting on this mountain, and just preaching, teaching them these things and sharing. Now, what is the fascinating thing about this? It's earlier when I said that this is a Jewish text. This is Matthew is really written for Jewish believers. It's believed to really be written for those that were Jewish, because obviously the early church they're all Jews. I mean, primarily all Jews. That when they first started becoming followers of Jesus Christ, they were all Jews. And it wasn't until later on, and even in Acts it talks about those Gentiles that came, those that were not of Jewish descent or not Jews, following Jewish customs, that started following Christ. And that's the whole major part of Paul's work, and so much more could be said. But in Matthew, again, the genealogy of Jesus being listed at the beginning would be very important for a Jewish reader to read that. It would be like a huge introduction, and now announcing, this amazing person, all these, credentials. That's what that is. But then it says, chapter 5, he sits on a mountainside. What is it? Then he starts talking about the Hebrew Scriptures, the laws that were laid down in the Hebrew Scripture. Now, what is that about? Now, maybe you've kind of figured it out, or you've already heard this before, but when Moses went onto Mount Sinai, when the children of Israel were in the desert after escaping Egypt, they go and God establishes the covenant in a very specific way by meeting with Moses, and he wanted to meet with the people, meeting with Moses on Mount Sinai, a mountain, and then gives the law. And how long is Moses up on the mountain? For all these days and nights, and God gives him the commandments by God's authority, even written in his own finger, and speaking face to face with Moses, gives him the law that the people are supposed to follow, that they live by. This is a relationship between God and his people. What does Jesus do? Here he's preaching and teaching and healing, showing God's work in the world, and he goes on the mountainside in chapter 5, and he starts to speak of who are the people of God, the Beatitudes. Blessed or happy are those, the poor in spirit, those who mourn. And he goes on and on. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world, in verses 13 and 14. And then he talks about this verse, which is chapter 5, verse 17, which I'll get to in a second. And it's really verse 17 through 20, and you really got to read this all the way through, and I'm not going to do that, but you got to read what he's saying here. And then after he says what he says in verses 17 through 20, he goes into 21. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And then in verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And then verse 31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. And then, but I tell you, verse 33, again you have heard it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, and it goes on. And then verse 38, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you. Verse 43, you have heard that it was said. And he goes on. And then in chapter 6, it goes on, and he gives more explanation of different things, prayer, fasting, acts of righteousness, and do not worry. And then chapter 7, about do not judge, or you too will be judged. You can read this. I'm just trying to kind of give you some of these famous sayings that we know, but maybe sometimes don't really connect them together. Remember, these are all kind of together and written together. Chapter 5, 6, and 7, they all come one after the other. It's all, if you have the red letter edition, there's red letters all the way through here. Jesus' words, speaking. So I wanted to spend some time, spend a little time already, just kind of laying the groundwork for what we're going to be doing as we're revisiting the mountain. Keeping in mind, going back to this, Moses received the law from God himself at Mount Sinai. Then what is being, in this text, really a Jewish text in a lot of ways, what is being said to these Jewish listeners, that they would understand it very clearly, that wow, now Jesus is claiming this authority, that going on the mountain and then now speaking about the law. And so he lays out these ways that we're to live.